Next, we have Dr. Gavin Murray. In her speech, Ms. Jeffrey Lam also referred to Dr. Murray. Dr. Murray is editor of Garland magazine in 2000 to 2007. Dr. Murray was director of Craft Victoria, where he developed the Scarf Festival and the South Project, a 4-year program of exchange involving Melbourne, Wellington, Santiago, and Johannesburg. We have two moderators for this segment, Professor Vincent Leung and Ms. Jeffrey Lam. The topic is
New Craft Renaissance, the role of thinker maker in heritage revival ครับ
Hi， 大家好。
Delightful to have friends coming from afar. This is especially so when we're separated so long by the COVID pandemic. I'm particularly pleased to be associated with the Intangible Cultural Heritage Program of the Lingnan University and Hong Kong Art School, supported by the Jockey Club. My primary focus here is the wider world, particularly the Eastern Hemisphere, where we are located. But I begin by briefly touching on the Western story of cultural rebirth in order to introduce a broader global theme of craft renaissance. Originality consists of returning to the origin. For the Barcelona architect Antonio Gaudí, creation was a sacramental process by which one connected with God. Within the biblical tradition, especially in the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden, God created an idyllic natural order which humans eventually corrupted. To be original today is therefore not primarily a matter of adding yet another human artifact to the ledger of history. It is instead to return to the source and to take inspiration from nature itself. Originality consists of returning to the origin. In the Western tradition, we're familiar with a similar retrospective framework in the Italian Renaissance, which is commonly understood as the birth of modern European civilization. Painters like Sandro Botticelli referred back to the classical Greek and Roman sources. This was not a mere act of repeating the past by blindly copying what might be found in historical ruins. It involved translating the past to suit the needs of the current time. The primarily visual sources of the classical era for the 15th century Italians was sculpture and architecture, but their new medium was oil painting. With the invention of perspective, it was possible to render these three-dimensional forms into two-dimensional windows to the world. While the Italian Renaissance saw the rise of the individual artist, this was at the expense of the craftsperson. Rather than labour in a dirty workshop, the artist became a scholar gentleman who could entertain nobility in his studio. Cennino Cennini, in his Craftsman Handbook, could write about painting, "Know that this work is truly that of a gentleman and that it can be practiced while dressed in velvet," velvet being a very delicate material. Europe had to wait until the end of the 19th century to have something like a craft renaissance in the arts and crafts movement, which began in England with figures such as William Morris. Morris looked back particularly to the medieval period. And he would write, "Apart from the desire to produce beautiful things, the leading passion of my life has been and is a hatred of modern civilization." And while associated with England, the arts and crafts movement took a global influence, particularly in anti-colonial struggles such as the push for Indian independence against British imperial rule. Mahatma Gandhi was very influenced by the English arts and crafts movement, particularly John Ruskin. And for him, it was about a return to the simplicity of the village. Without an intelligent return to simplicity, there is no escape from our descent to a state lower than brutality. The arts and crafts movement subsided in the early 20th century with the rise of consumerism and the abundance of cheap industrially made goods. But in recent times, we've seen the rise of a similar movement to revive traditional crafts, but with an important difference. So what is happening now? I'd like to share with you one of the key learnings from the journey of Garland magazine. Garland began in 2015 as an exploration to reach into all corners of the wider world and gather compelling stories behind the objects that we make. There was a sense that our Western lens focused only on part of what is happening. We tend to look exclusively in spaces that are detached from everyday life, such as galleries and museums. We overlook the role of objects in other spaces, such as processions, festivals, homes, and temples. Over 21 issues, we focused on a particular creative place thanks to local advisors who sourced stories and helped come up with the concept that reflected the value of what is being made. For our China issue, for instance, we used the concept of ancient now to reflect the many projects that seek to revive traditional crafts as part of the story of socialism with Chinese characteristics. This involved a theme around the dragon in contemporary life, and we had an exhibition in Qingdao called Living with Dragons. But by far the most common story was most common story that we uncovered involved a revival of a lost or forgotten craft. So what I'd like to do now is just briefly give you a few examples of these stories from our time that we uncovered. So to begin with, Lisa Healy was a master's student in Melbourne who belonged to the Tolai tribe of Papua New Guinea. In a museum, she saw this magnificent shell necklace, and her feeling was that of great sadness that the necklace was abandoned, that it had no life. And so she decided, as part of her master's project, to try and recreate that necklace shell by shell. And in the process, learned a lot in the making about her culture, but also then was able to reintroduce this necklace to her tribe. And it gave great honor to elders who could recover this lost tradition and ceremony. So the research, even though it was scholarly, also had a very important cultural significance in the renaissance of her tribe. We had a lot of stories from Iran, and as you know, Iranian culture has many layers of history, and this provides a very rich resource, particularly for female jewelers. For instance, Barak Omidfar is a very talented young Iranian jeweler who draws on the mythologies of past Iran, such as the Qanat, which is a kind of a canal, an underground aqueduct, where there was a ceremony in which a woman was married to the water to provide fertility to it, and she used elements of it to create a ring series. And so in recovering this ancient culture of Iran, it's also providing a language of empowerment for young female jewelers. In China, we worked closely with Tsinghua University and the China Lacquer Alliance. This is an event in Qingzhou in Hubei province a couple of years ago, before COVID-19. And it was a very interesting moment where, as part of their program to give new life to lacquer art, they had an exhibition, and one of the questions was, how can you tell what's authentic lacquer? And it was decided that this is only revealed not by the normal light of a gallery, but by candlelight. And here we have one of the leaders of this movement in a tour of the participants to discover this. I'm very proud where I come from in my region of Victoria, the city of Bendigo commissioned the revival of a dragon for its collection. It's one of the largest dragons in the world, which is part of an annual festival close to where I live. And this helped many of the traditional artisans in Hong Kong who create these dragons provide the necessary business to keep going. There's some extraordinary work coming from Latin America. This is just one from Chile, Constanza Rutia Wegman. And the Inca textiles, which have very intricate patterns, provide a very useful reference point for contemporary artists. And with quite serious scholarship, she was able to recreate the structure of the textiles to produce magnificent new tapestries that could adorn houses and rooms in Chile. So this is going back to the pre-contact time before the Spanish arrived to discover this. And now to South Africa, where in the new South Africa after apartheid, many South Africans are recovering their tribal roots. This is Andile Dilvane, and he's produced a series of ceramics that are both art objects, but also play a key role in reviving a ceremony in his village. He's a Xhosa, the same as Nelson Mandela, from the same people. And he uses this to recreate the ceremonies that are part of this particular village. So, while these stories share a similar return to origins as found in the arts and crafts movement, there is one common denominator that is new: the writer. These stories are largely self-authored. Many of them were developed as part of postgraduate study, like a master's or PhD. And this reflects an unprecedented generation of craftspersons who have also completed an academic degree. And this includes many from Eastern countries who've studied abroad and now return to apply their learning, some of whom might be listening to this talk now. As Garland embarks on its second journey, we've developed a special role to take advantage of this new generation, the thinker-maker. This is an evolution of the designer-maker role developed in the 20th century, in which craftspersons pursued the abstract process of product development to meet new markets. This lent their work a level of authenticity, combining skill and aesthetics. Now, the designer-maker has a definite position in the marketplace as a producer of saleable goods. Where is the livelihood of the thinker-maker? The primary support is clearly academic, where a salaried position can support a dual practice of making and writing. But given the rarity of these and the abundance of graduates, alternative pathways need to be found. There is an allied development in the return of the master, as documented by Richard Osejo's book, Masters of Craft. In this case, mostly male-educated middle-class graduates embrace a heritage manual trade, such as barista or tailor. What these offer is not just a practical skill, but also the knowledge that it embodies. For instance, a barber is not there just to cut hair, but to make patrons feel comfortable in their skin. And it's quite a remarkable turn that these manual trades, which would have been seen as quite humble and lowly, are being taken up by those who might otherwise become lawyers or doctors. But there is this sense that they provide some sort of practical and immediate service. And it's done not just as a physical skill, but also as a form of knowledge. It's about understanding of that trade and its history. It's a kind of professionalizing of the manual trades. And this craft revival is expressed in the campaign, The Future is Handmade, which was very popular a couple of years ago. And I have to say that the innovative heritage education program in Lingnam University, to me anyway, plays a pioneering role in this revival by linking artists to heritage crafts. And very pleased to have a story about this in the current issue of Garland, which is about the connection between past and future, called Regeneration, which relates very well to the theme of my talk today. So let's have a look at the thinker makers. Sorry, here we are with the story in Garland. For Garland, our thinker makers take on a residency during which they can make an object that answers a question. For our first issue of this journey, the Aboriginal thinker maker Tyson Yunka Porter demonstrated the approach that formed his book Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, where each idea is embodied in a carved object. We were very lucky to have Tyson Yunka Porter feature because he's now become quite an international celebrity. He must have appeared on more than 200 podcasts, and his ideas have been taken up by many. And part of it is this notion of embodied knowledge, knowledge which is preserved in objects. And for our issue, he carved a canoe and shared the learnings that he gained in the process of doing that. I should say prior to that, of interest is that he participated in our conversation between dragons, because his people, the Aboriginal people, believe in a figure very similar to the Chinese dragon, the rainbow serpent. And so there was much interesting comparisons, and we found out, in fact, that dragons weren't necessarily exclusive to Chinese culture, but almost in every culture. The current thinker maker is Pamela C., otherwise known as Shui Mei Ling. And she's a specialist in paper cutting who traces a line of development to 3D printing and augmented reality. So I think what's very interesting about her work is that, you know, we might consider crafts such as paper cutting as sort of heritage that need to be preserved intact, and the remnants of a manual age, certainly before laser cutting. But for her, it's part of a continuum, and she's able to trace this and its evolution without necessarily meaning that paper cutting is redundant. It still has its own place, but it is not made redundant by 3D printing and augmented reality. Now, I wanted to end by sharing with you a new platform that's emerging out of Garland, which relates to craft innovations in information management. It comes out of a fairly conventional project of the World Craft Council Asia Pacific region, which was the online encyclopedia of crafts, which included 500 entries from around 50 different countries of the region, and was the first time that this knowledge had been gathered together, and there's a lot of work yet to be done on it, but it was a beginning. But it revealed a network of craft scholars and experts across our region that were beforehand not connected, and it seemed important to find a way of connecting them together. And at the same time, we see in information management an innovation beyond the encyclopedia to the knowledge graph. And unfortunately, I don't have time to really explain in detail what a knowledge graph is, but it's a much more interconnected understanding of knowledge. So this year, a knowledge house of craft will emerge, which is an association of craft scholars, at whose heart is what we call the Wheel, which is a repository of craft wisdom and heritage that sustains a lineage going back to the ancient Baghdad House of Wisdom, and the then 18th century, what followed that, which was the 18th century French encyclopédie, which put craft at the centre of knowledge. So it's its own kind of renaissance, but a renaissance of craft knowledge. So finally, now is the time to think again about thinking. In the modern West, the thinker is most famously represented as a naked figure, absorbed in nothing else but his own thoughts. He is detached from the world. A very different picture of the thinker is found in the East. The East Asian scholar is a much more sensuous figure, finely attuned to the material world. I kind of like this scroll because even though we know of it as an inkstone, the scholar seems to be looking at his smartphone in ancient times. We're facing a global challenge which requires us to recover our connection to the earth. Thinker makers will play a key role in helping us relearn its language, the language of earth, metal, fibre, wood, glass, and so on. And I hope our project and us working together will make a contribution to this reawakening. Thank you, 谢谢.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone on the metro is also a thinker, like I'm holding a pack now? Dr. Murray, we have now Lingnan University, Professor Leung from Department of History, and our academic head of Hong Kong Art School, Java Lam, with us now. So we will now head into our Q&A section. Audience on the floor and audience online, you're most welcome to leave your comment and question, and we'll facilitate our conversation here. Okay, so over to you. Thank you.
Hello, Kelvin. I'm
Yes,
here.
ni hao.
Yeah, you know, I'm sitting in a main furniture.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Nice to have you. Professor.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Murray. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Yong.
Yeah, Kevin, I have so many questions I would like to ask, and regarding of the thinker maker, because you know how much I keen on that, and I'm trying to be one of them. and from last 3 years education program, we do have a lot of thinker maker, which graduate from our BA program in art school. I mean, not only in our school, also in other art institutions. The work they create, I wish you are here. If you see that from our annual showcase, you will see how much they can reach. Not only in the design, furnitures, I mean, also in the artwork piece. This is the questions I really want to, ask your comment. It's very difficult to recruit them in the early beginning. And I'm not sure in the coming project, will those young art practitioners will come to apply for this, kind of old-fashioned stuff. But honestly, I can see the huge improvement of their art practice, I mean the artwork, because they were my student before. And such a shamefully, I have to handle them, to other masters to train them again. And then they become the real artists. So do you have any clue? Because you are in RMIT, that is combining all those craft course and the art together. Is there anything you can suggest or anything can share about how to encourage those young art practitioners come to appreciate and join the Ice Age course?
Thanks very much, Jeff Lam. I find that there are 3 key motives that young people have for taking this particular path. The first of these is about the environment and cultural sustainability, that young generation know that the planet that they will inherit will have a lot of challenges environmentally, and that we have to change. Certainly our use of fossil fuels, but also in the kind of materials that we consume. And so thinking about this in terms of materiality is much more relevant to this generation, and it's one that craft connects them to. So that's the first particular interest. The second is around cultural issues, because these days we know that people are very concerned that their cultures, where they come from, which tribe they belong to, and in this way, it's very important for them to be able to express themselves using the craft which represents that culture in an immediate sense. And it gives them a way of transacting it, that they can produce objects representing these cultures that others can enjoy. And the third is about a sense of connection. I think maybe heritage is often seen as something whereby you blindly copy something of the past. So naturally young people feel that it's not appealing, because they want to have a sense of agency to make a change in some way. But what your program does, and what the others have shown, particularly those who combine their work with the university, is that it's possible to interpret the past in new ways. And we saw some of this in the lacquer work from Kanazawa, for instance. So I feel that that adventure of interpreting the past and seeing this as something which gives them the opportunity to make a difference, but also feel connected. Because I think a lot of young people feel connected, need to feel connected, and particularly in terms of going forwards to the future, to know what sort of past they inherit. So these are the three themes that I think are particularly strong. And around that is the sense of authenticity, because as we know, with the popularity of social media, people need these days to have a unique story to tell. And whether it's through Instagram or Weibo or other forms. And what these offer is certainly authentic, unique stories, not just blindly following some other fashion, but finding your own story.
Thank you so much. And we do have the IG. Please follow us.
Yes, thank you, Jaffa. And yeah, Dr. Murray, thank you again for your talk. Actually, I do have a comment or question inspired by your talk. The vantage point that I have is quite different from what Jaffa just articulated, in part because of my profession. I don't practice crafts, rather I'm a researcher of Chinese history, specifically ancient Chinese history. I work on ancient Chinese thought. And so when I first started to listen to your talk, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. You know, how am I going to engage with this topic that is quite new to me? Nevertheless, along the way, I actually found myself quite inspired by a lot of the ideas that you shared with us. And even though the topic that you dealt with today, the materials you shared with us today are very much about what is happening right now. What is happening in the world of crafts and craftsmanship right now. I nevertheless was actually quite surprised to find a lot of resonance with ideas that I encountered in my own work, in my own research, in the world of ancient Chinese philosophy, the world of Confucius, the world of Lao Tzu, the world of Mencius. Now let me elaborate on that a little bit. In this body of very old philosophical texts from more than 2,000 years ago, there was indeed this very rich discourse and debate about the idea of making things, the idea of crafts. Very big questions like what is the nature of the creative process? What is actually involved when someone chose to make something out of nothing? Who gets to do that? Who grants the authority for someone or to someone to do that? You know, what is the economics behind that? There's a really rich discussion of that in that body of literature from early China. Just to cite one very famous example, Confucius once said, "I only transmit but do not create." You know, 学而不做，所以不作。So an idea like that, I mean, he did not say anything more besides that 4 characters, but nevertheless, an idea like that prompted centuries of discussion about the nature of the creative process and the authority of creation. Now, more specifically, this notion of the thinker-maker, this really exciting, tantalizing concept of the thinker-maker makes me think of one text in particular from this body of philosophical literature, and that is the Zhuangzi. And actually, in that text, he also has a theory of craftsmanship, and he's really focused on the idea of crafts. Doing craft to him is one key way to properly understand the world, to engage with the world and to really understand it. And according to him, in my own reading, he would say in the life of a craftsman, there are 3 stages. First, you are just a craftsman. You just make the things. You have not mastered the craft yet. You just make those objects one after another in a really repetitive way. Then you reached a second stage at a certain point, and that is the stage I think that resembles what you described as the thinker-maker. The craftsman became reflective of the process. He is able to reflect on the process and be able to write about it and explain it to other people. He can talk about it, as opposed to struggling with the craftsmanship at the first stage. However, interestingly, Zhuangzi would say that's not the end of the process. If he really becomes a master craftsman, he would eventually abandon language. He would get to the stage where he simply makes things again, but now very skillfully. All those knowledge that he accumulated through the many, many years of making things and talking about it and writing about it are now fully embodied in the work that he does. Now, why would he abandon language? Zhuangzi would say, well, because ultimately language is insufficient. It has its own limitation. It cannot ultimately describe what goes on in that very delicate, subtle process of craftsmaking. And that's Zhuangzi. One doesn't have to agree with him, but I think listening to your talk and listening to seeing some of the examples of craftsmen, thinker-makers that you share with us today really make me think about that. And I think it really opens up a space for us to explore the relationship between crafts and language. Are these craftsmen aware that they are thinker-makers? These categories, I wonder, are they aware of their own work as writers? And if so, how does that figure into their work as craftsmen? So I think that's kind of where I am at after listening to this really exciting talk, and I just want to kind of raise this issue for you to consider. And I think it's just really exciting to hear about this concept of the thinker-maker and this potential new avenue for research, reflection on the relationship between language and crafts. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's terrific to hear from an expert in Chinese philosophy, because the glimpses I have are very rich. And I feel, certainly as somebody who's not Chinese, there's so much to learn. For our China issue, particularly with lacquer, we touched a lot on the Tang dynasty and the sensibility then around, particularly in poetry, the moon, and this concept, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, of Wu Gan, which is the feeling of things. Because in the West, we normally think that feelings are projected onto objects. We project our memories, our desires onto objects, whereas in this particular period with Wu Gan, the idea was that objects also have their own feelings that project onto us, which is really what we felt helped us understand the power of lacquer amongst other kinds of materials. So this seemed a very important one that was critical to unpack, which we hope to continue further. And I think that's a very exciting moment as craft discourse becomes global, and we can enrich our understanding of that. Now, in terms of the identity of thinker-maker, it comes from two things. One is that having a platform to give makers an opportunity to tell their story. And we do it in a particular way, which is quite personal. We even encourage them to leave an audio message so you can hear the voice of the maker as well. So it's an opportunity to understand their thinking and their experience as a platform rather than just something which might sit on a shelf, which is otherwise mute. So that's one very immediate way. But the other is, which I mentioned earlier on, this quite rare moment we're at. Universities like yours and mine have been now producing a generation of postgraduates from the crafts, and obviously very few of them will end up taking academic positions. So what do the rest do? They have this unique combination of practical skill and theoretical knowledge. They can't sell it at a market, but there are other opportunities potentially that we should be exploring as part of the broader ecology that we're creating in terms of craft knowledge. And for me, it's things like publications, but it's also giving workshops, it's doing consultancies, it's often connected to a place in a community, doing commissions, so that there's an object that can tell a story. And I guess that's the key element that's emerging here, is that stories need homes. You can see behind me, I've got a lot of books, as so many of your rooms have, and we think of stories as naturally living inside books, but books are becoming more or less anachronistic now, but we still need a place to keep our stories, and makers who can put a story in an object that we can live with, we can wear, like those beautiful brooches that you've got at the moment on both your outfits, and the gifts that where we give a gift of a story to someone else. It's understanding the mechanics of that which are important. So I think it's like one of those situations where they say, if you build it, they will come. It's a situation where if you create the role of thinker-maker, then people will find this as a particular path that broadens and enriches what they have to offer. And it's really a shared journey where we have to continually be imagining what the possibilities of that might be, which is what we're trying to do in Garland and the Knowledge House of Craft.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Is there any questions? Otherwise, I have tons of the questions to ask. Yes, it seems no questions so far. Honestly, I really appreciate what you mentioned about the thinker-maker. As I told you, I also learned lacquer before. I work in wood also, and also most of my students know I coach them strictly on the craftsmanship. But the interesting is, I find that it do need a few years to go to practice and practice and practice. And I only got a short life. So for me, lacquer is 20 years ago I work with. And for wood, I work on it 20 years. And in coming years, I think I might only focus in wood and fabric. Because we all have our limit in time, how to make it, have more people to really conceal all these legends, heritage, and to have a more variety. I would say more people and to take one or two. Everyone might have one skill, one life. I'm not sure. Yeah.
We all have one life, but I think that's the magic of a civilization, that it can accommodate specialization, that people can dedicate their lives to a particular material. Often I find with makers, it's a matter of falling in love with the material. It's like a marriage. You're married to your wood or lacquer or glass. And I think as we have people who specialize in different languages, we strengthen as a civilization and society if we allow for that specialization to occur. And I think it's a challenge for universities, of course, because that means you need a lot of resources to distribute that. So many universities like my own now are creating kind of semi-apprenticeships where students can go out and do work in a workshop as part of their degree so that they can get that level of specialisation as part of a placement. And I think that experience, which connects them to others, is very important. And so, but I think we certainly need to encourage it. And if you try and do too much, a jack of all trades, then you lose the magic of that particular skill.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelvin. I wish we have more time. But Ian
Thank you,
is
Sheshe.
waiting here. Thank you so much.
Sajan.